Funding for this program has been made possible through a generous donation from Xerox Corporation, whose innovative document solutions, products, services, and support are designed to enhance business productivity.
Helen Keller's Bible, Abe Lincoln's spectacles, an undated, unsigned powder horn, a toast to George Washington, the District of Columbia's Slave Code, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. The Library of Congress has mounted a new and historic exhibition, American Treasures. The artifacts were chosen from among the library's riches. They tell us what our society prizes the most, our treasures. Treasure. The word conjures up an ancient wooden chest crammed with jewels, silver and gold, the exotic loot of kings. Finding it will make us rich forevermore. We value gold, silver, jewels, but we also value the things we love. We value people. Art. Nature. Beauty. Knowledge. We value the future. And yet, to know our way, we look to the past. The past. We value the past, but how can we know it? The past is a foreign country, but we can always visit. The books and objects that help us remember are the currency of that country. They let us walk around in places that vanished long ago, leaving a shallow wake of names and dates and wars and words.
You know, every old story, it used to be, started once upon a time, long, long ago. But I see history as an extension or an expansion of life. It's enlarging the circle of your experience as a human being. Why limit what you experience, what you know, who you know, to just this little piece of time that our biological clocks allow each of us, when the whole of the human story and the whole of human experience is all available to us through books, through films, through poetry, through the creations of mankind, architecture, music. And to me, history is all of that.
The site of the American Treasures exhibition is the Thomas Jefferson Building. It was constructed 100 years ago, just as the United States was becoming one of the most powerful nations in the world. It was one of the grandest buildings in the country, 8 years in construction, costing the incredible sum of $6 million. The result was a poem in 15 kinds of marble under a shining copper dome, a shimmering pleasure palace of the mind.
The Jefferson Building is one of the most beautiful buildings in all of Washington. The creativity of the Renaissance is all suggested in that marvelous building. The wonderful frescoes, the wonderful details of the ceilings and the hallways and the tiles on the floor and the sense of stability. This is a place of substance. And it was built by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a government building and built to stand there for the long run.
The Library of Congress houses over 110 million items on more than 500 miles of shelves. There are 27 million books and pamphlets in 470 languages. The largest library in the world. Everything is preserved, from the towering words of the Declaration of Independence to scratchy tapes of nursery rhymes. Both lofty and mundane are saved so future generations can get the picture. What life in America has been like.
The library stores all this material and makes it available for people who are interested in the world. We record it in the written word, we record it in the oral word, we record it in the pictorial word.
The library houses letters, maps, drawings, paintings, manuscripts, legal documents, magazines, newspapers, printed music, recorded sound, prints, photographs, films, TV programs. The floor space is some 65 acres, enough for a small dairy farm.
And when I walked into the main reading room, I tell you,
the main reading room of the Jefferson Building pays elaborate homage to the graceful world of the past. But the Computer Catalog Center is an exercise in modern times, with reader desks wired for electronic note-taking, all in the service of knowledge and learning, frequented by researchers from all over the world.
people sometimes say to me, "Are you working on a book?" And I say, "Yes, I am." But I really would like to say, "No, I'm working in the book. I mean, inside the subject." And when you get into a great collection, you've stepped out of your own life to a very large degree, and you're in that other time, inside that other experience.
A researcher doesn't look at an object, he interacts with the object. People ask questions of research items, and they often get very surprising answers.
Once you start writing, then you begin to understand how much you don't know, how much you don't have, how much you need to go out and look for, how many questions there are still to answer. That's really what you're doing. You're not always just finding answers. You're creating new questions the farther along you go, which makes it all the more exciting.
When you do primary research, you go back to the original documents. If you think about it, it's like a detective looking for clues. The detective doesn't just want to find out what other people say. The detective wants to go back and check to see if, say, there are footprints or fingerprints.
I've never worked on a detective case, but it's like working on a detective case. And one thing does lead to another, always. And you get excited about it. You get on a track. You want to know more and more and more. You're exploring, and you have to have your eyes open.
Can you find evidence? Can you find a document? Can you find a letter, something with a person's signature, so that you're really getting hard evidence about what happened?
There is nothing like knowing that you're holding a piece of paper that the person who created it held and trying to imagine the state of mind that person was in when the paper was blank.
It's a tangible connection. And somehow the time that divides you from them vanishes. And you feel their humanity across 100 years of time, across 2,000 miles of geography, whatever it is. And you are in touch, directly in touch, with another human being. And that is a thrilling experience that can't be described.
Thomas Jefferson's library was the seedling for the present library. But the tree that grew there now bears all kinds of fruit. choosing from among them for the American Treasures exhibition is no simple task. What constitutes a treasure?
Something that has universal quality. The Constitution of the United States, or the Declaration of Independence, or Columbus's Book of Privileges, where there's only 3 that exist in the whole world. One of them is here at the Library of Congress. That's a universal treasure. I believe everyone would recognize that wherever you are, in Beijing or in St. Petersburg or in London or Paris or Madrid. That's a treasure.
But at the same time, you could have a manuscript, for example, of a man who was a prisoner of war of Japan in the first years of the war caught in the Philippines. It's a memoir or a diary written while in captivity, and to somebody studying America in the Second World War, this would be a treasure.
We have value in practically every meaning of the word represented in our collections. You can take the Gutenberg Bible, which is valued at about $20 million, or you can take a dime novel, which is valued at maybe $1.50.
But sometimes it's not money that makes it a treasure. It's its worth as far as its importance for understanding a culture.
And in order to understand a culture and explain it to others, you have to see the things that that culture used on an everyday basis. So we want things like comic books and daily newspapers and the contents of Lincoln's pocket at the time he was shot.
A treasure is something that works on many different levels. And you can look at something and you may appreciate it for its artistic value. But then it also works because it depicts an important moment or an individual who made a significant impact.
We have in the exhibit a letter that's written by Mary Lincoln to her husband, Abraham Lincoln. And in typically 19th century style, she writes, "My dear husband." And she says that General McClellan has got the slows and ought to be replaced.
We have the wife of the president advising her husband on what to do, which is to fire McClellan.
For Mary Lincoln to have said this to her husband in the midst of the war is the kind of thing that we find fascinating. I mean, people complain about modern first ladies saying too much, and here we have one 100 years ago suggesting this.
Tradition gathers itself bit by bit. One generation's trivia becomes the next generation's treasure.
There was one treasure, and we went deeper into the collections. We found ourselves more and more delighted by what we found and wanting to share that with people. So that from one division that collects serial publications, their most treasured collection, for example, is early comic books. How could they not be treasured? But I think it's a surprise for people to realize that we have not just the first comic book. We have a nearly comprehensive collection of comic books.
We save them because, after all, what's more American than a comic book? It's sort of like hot dogs and apple pie. It's action and romance. It's familiar to everyone. You can go back in time, or you can go into the future in a comic book. You can laugh at it, or you can be challenged by it.
From comics, we learned that Donald Duck was perpetually irritable. The only one without flaw was, of course, Superman.
Superman is standing there and being struck by lightning bolts. And his reaction to something that would kill a normal human being is to say it tickles. We thought that showed his superness.
At times, trivia becomes valuable in the most basic sense. It's worth money. Once, Johnny Evers came between Tinker and Chance. The cards were thrown in when you bought tobacco. Now, they're worth thousands. America values baseball. Perhaps that's because it evokes an earlier time, a bucolic rural age, or a time when athletic heroes like Lou Gehrig smoked and smiled. And the past is always too powerful to resist.
And so we get things like a 15th century printed book, the Columbus Letter, and we also get a 20th century cookbook on how to make bread.
Cookbooks from Betty Crocker and others taught homemakers how to prepare pig's heads, rabbit that looked like a rabbit, and other edibles tried and true. The Chinese, meanwhile, studied calf's liver and sweetbreads. 700 sandwiches, not surprisingly, included some novelties. Throughout our history, of course, we ate. But usually we ate best on Sundays. Taken together, the treasures, however mixed, seem like a single story. The life story of the nation. It tells of weddings and funerals, of things seen and things imagined, in a variety as vast as one person's dreams.
It's the whole spectrum of human nature. And I don't think there's anything more interesting to we human beings than other human beings, whether they are with us now or went before us. And that's what those shards of all kinds from the past are about. Life as it was happening, then realized for us in the record.
Some treasures tell us what we used to think the world was like. Native land to many peoples for centuries, America suddenly became the New World. People from Europe thought they'd discovered it and owned it. But even the European view of the world changed as it moved from flat to round. German Martin Waldseemüller first used the name America on his 1507 map honoring Amerigo Vespucci. In his map, German cartographer Johann Reusch deposited America right below Asia. In the first book about America, published by Muslims in 1732, we can recognize the shape, but the northwestern border of America is as open-ended as the future. The first globes of modern times were made in the late 15th century in Europe. The first American globe maker was James Wilson, born in 1763. This meticulous map, drawn in 1803, helped Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They took it with them on their ambitious expedition after the Louisiana Purchase doubled the big new country in size. We had land, lots of land, but we didn't even know what it looked like. George Wheeler took 2 boats 200 miles up the Colorado to the Grand Canyon in 1871. We know this because Wheeler took a photographer with him. As the contours of America changed, life within it was transformed. We were a whole country of Connecticut Yankees, a nation that mothered invention after invention. American treasures of ingenuity, American treasures of discovery. Robert Fulton came up with the steam engine and also the submarine. Samuel Morse, the telegraph. Alexander Graham Bell, the telephone. Cars rolled into our lives early this century. We climbed right behind the wheel and never got out. The Wright brothers unveiled their flying machine in 1903.
Orville Wright's pocket diary describes the early flights on that historic occasion at Kitty Hawk. In the telegram to their father telling about the flight, they say, "Inform the press." So it seems to me they were well aware that this was a historic occasion and they wanted to get all the benefit.
In the 1870s, a man in New Jersey began tinkering with tinfoil.
Here is this incredibly crude piece of tinfoil, which was the first medium used to record and play back sound. I think sound is essential to understanding American culture, particularly the culture of the 20th century. We don't even know what recordings on that tinfoil, if any. It's a treasure in a symbolic sense. This represents the absolute beginning of this art form and industry.
The inventor was Thomas Edison. The machine was called the phonograph, and it played wax cylinders. In 1878, he virtually abandoned it to work on the incandescent lamp. Others took up Edison's work on sound, including Emil Berliner, a German immigrant who invented what he called the gramophone. It played flat discs.
100 years ago, Edison was making cylinders, Berliner was making gramophones. Berliner prevailed. The flat gramophone disc that we know of as the 78 and the LP prevailed. Interestingly enough, though, in America, Edison's name stuck with it. His trade name for the cylinder, the phonograph, we use for all disc recordings now.
Why don't we try it again from the top, from the title?
Some treasures are a way to capture forever what was once as fleeting as the wind.
Sometime when the river is ice, ask me mistakes I have made.
Recordings give us the sounds of the past, of everything we can imagine.
That's good. Why don't you go to the next one, please?
We're now going to record some songs by Mr. Joe Cole. He's a very fine singer.
Everybody get your partners.
Through sound, we can come the closest to what the original experience was. We hear politicians, not firsthand through personal visits, but through radio and television now in a way that no one did 100 years ago. That might be as valuable as a Jefferson book in which Jefferson might have read about English law.
Fred Ott sneezed, and film was born. In 1888, Edison resolved to invent a new technology to do for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear.
And these are the sort of, I would say, the beginnings of film history. Little films made for what was called the kinetoscope, which was the peep show viewer, that were produced in Thomas Edison's laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey in the early 1890s.
The mutoscope used similar principles. The viewer peeked through an aperture and turned a crank, rotating the wheel of sequential photographs. A light flashed on, and the photographs flickered momentarily to life.
In its 100 years of existence, the motion picture has been devoted to as broad a range of human creativity and knowledge as the print medium has in its over 400 years of existence.
Today, there are more than 1 million films, videotapes, video discs, and recordings archived at the Library of Congress. Treasures that defeat time. They let us see what once would have vanished forever.
These are films that document streetcars and the dress of everyday people in 1894-95, the popular entertainers of the day, the people who were the great athletes of the day.
They also captured many of the important and notorious personages of American culture from the last century.
What we have, in a sense, here at the library, in its film and television collections, is culture in a can. Film is a recording medium. Its widest use for American culture has been to simply record how we sing, how we dance, how we laugh, how we look. And so when you say culture in a can, you're looking at people's past, in often cases it's past that those people don't even know about. Future generations will no longer really see a distinction between high art and low art, or popular culture and official culture. Motion pictures will be just as important as presidential letters.
But the record of the 20th century is a fragile one. Lost forever are more than 80% of America's movies from the silent era before 1920. And over half of all made through 1950. The record of this century is largely on the new media: videotape, audio tape, and film. But how do you preserve a one-of-a-kind legacy?
Like the Gettysburg Address, which was written on pretty poor paper with inks that corrode further into the paper, we have to make sure that we retard that corrosion as much as possible by eliminating all the things that accelerate it, like air and light. And we take very special precautions for documents like that, which are of inestimable value and are literally irreplaceable.
The American people deserve to see their founding documents. They're about freedom, after all. So the library's conservators have to reverse the flow of time.
We work primarily on the rarest materials in the library. There are so many in a library of this size, millions and millions really, that we have enough work for, 1,200 people for 12 lifetimes, I would think. And still we'd just be sort of stemming the tide.
Their tools remind you of surgical instruments, but their craftsmanship recalls the finest artisans of the Middle Ages. The conservators, using the latest scientific techniques, restore irreplaceable treasures to health, always with an eye toward changing them as little as possible, preserving the intentions of the creators. Treasures before and treasures after. It often looks like magic.
It may seem like magic when it's done in the hands of somebody who's extremely skilled, but it's built up over endless repetitions. So it is magic, but it's magic that's earned.
Many of the treasures for the exhibition received special restoration treatment. An early map, based on the exploration of Captain John Smith, got a bath to remove old acidic backing that eats away at the paper.
The general approach is a very human approach. It's to try to prevent deterioration before it happens. It's what we as human beings do. Try to prevent aging, if we can, by reducing stress to these materials.
Other treasures for the exhibition, like this watercolor, weakened and broken by constant refolding, were painstakingly made whole once again.
It's a real privilege to have contributed in a very significant way to the survival for the next generation to look at.
One of the greatest treasures of the library is the Bay Psalm book, the first surviving book printed in North America.
It was probably bound in the early 17th century, and we would want the book to be slightly stronger, but not changed at all in appearance.
A hymnal once so commonplace that no one thought to save it. Today, there are only 11 copies known in the world, and they are priceless.
One can never say where what's valuable for me stops and what's valuable for another person starts. A book, a manuscript, a print, a photograph, it isn't in itself valuable. It's what the person finds in it which is valuable.
Even a prosaic insurance map, made just to tell insurance companies if buildings were likely to catch fire, can bear witness to the birth of a legend. Tombstone, Arizona, where Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday met the Clanton gang in a notorious gunfight. The legend has obscured the facts that there was an OK Corral. The story was real. Legends do that. We even forget that the Declaration of Independence was written at all.
That it wasn't something written on a tablet by God and handed down by Thomas Jefferson. This step that the country was taking, a very brave step, it was worked out on paper by human beings.
But the rough draft in the exhibition was Thomas Jefferson's third effort.
A version that he thought was close to perfect. I'm sure he thought it was close to perfect. He put an awful lot of thought into it. It was given to others to comment on and to amend and make changes, including Adams and Franklin and a whole committee of people. And they changed the language.
When you realize how few days were spent doing that, you can't help but take your hat off to those people.
It was something that was developed in a colloquy between men and arguments. And all of that is visible in these 4 pages of the document. And it is a harbinger of the way that Americans have agreed upon the great issues of their history, which is to argue and to compromise, and to respect the compromise at the end of the day.
The words at the end say, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. Those aren't just words. The British fleet had just arrived in New York. The largest expeditionary force ever sent out by the British Empire up to that point had come to crush this upstart notion of a new country. And they would all be hanged. They were traitors by signing their names to that document. But they did it. They were in truth pledging their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor.
We often take the Declaration of Independence and what it means a little for granted. So too the generals and presidents, the men who made history as we usually think of it. They have long since turned into stone. they've become their great acts and lost their everyday humanity. On the night in 1865 when Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, in his pockets was found an oddly poignant collection of small things. 2 pairs of spectacles, a pocket knife, a brown wallet, a watch fob, a linen handkerchief, and there was a $5 bill, a $5 Confederate bill.
They're a very important set of objects that stimulate people to connect. They make people feel connected with a man and an experience and a time and a place.
It's hard to believe that great men were once children with childhood dreams. Hoping to master the art of surveying, one young man copied out exercises in geometry at the ripe old age of 11. Then, in a flowing hand, he wrote his name, George Washington, father of our country. We don't usually associate kitchen gadgets with great leaders, yet these carefully recorded plans for a pasta machine were drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1787. And the bull moose himself, the gruff Rough Rider, Teddy Roosevelt, was also a doting father.
He wrote to his son who was 3 years old, who hadn't learned to read yet, and the letter is filled with pictographs. They're actual drawings of animals and things that he thought would amuse his son. And I think that while some people know that teddy bears are named after Teddy Roosevelt, they might think that it's ironic that he was a man who was known for killing big game, but would assume that he didn't have a very tender side. And here's evidence that he did, indeed.
The treasures of history are usually linked with great names. But what about compelling lives of ordinary people? People whose names we don't know. Perhaps there's such a thing as a treasure of the ordinary. The daguerreotype, invented in 1839, was the first version of the photograph commercially available in the United States. The young Abe and Mary Lincoln sat for such pictures. But it was also possible for the average person to pose for a portrait.
An anonymous seamstress, the image of a locksmith, an anonymous locksmith. And here they are, looking very proud beside the tools of their trade, and that's really what that mid-century time was about, the lending political, social, and economic access to people who before had never had it.
I personally get the greatest kick of all in finding the letters or the diaries or the recorded reminiscences or photographs or whatever of people you never heard of, who were obscure even in their own day, very possibly. And suddenly they come back to life. And they're there to tell you how it was, what it was like to have been alive in that other time.
In April 1906, the great San Francisco earthquake struck, wrecking the lives of famous and anonymous alike. 3 competing newspapers banded together to bring the story to readers from first-hand accounts.
We have in the exhibit a panoramic view of the destruction that befell San Francisco in the great earthquake at the beginning of the 20th century. But at the same time, we have in the exhibit a letter from a woman who is really somewhat unlettered. It's an 8-page letter without a single piece of punctuation in it. Nellie Keohane describes what it was like to be living in San Francisco at the time.
Had to be dug out as they were pinned in, and lots of them killed, and the fire was worse than the earthquake, and in 5 minutes after the shock it started, but it was lucky.
David McCullough's book, The Path Between the Seas, recounts the history of the creation of the Panama Canal and the staggering impact of disease that claimed tens of thousands of lives.
And then one day, I was working with a collection of material that was in a box, almost like a shoebox. And I opened it up, and I took it out, and it was the death certificates of all the people who had died in the French hospital at Panama from yellow fever. And it told you their names, their height, the color of their eyes, their weight, where they were from, what each person's job was. And suddenly, those brave people weren't just statistics anymore. They were human beings with a story, each one of them. And to hold those in one's hands, knowing that the doctors, the nurses held them in their hands, that really was powerful.
Some of the library's musical treasures are represented by its vast collection of sheet music.
It's the full record of American creativity, not by greats, but by everybody who created songs who felt that their work should be protected by copyright. And it's true we have Irving Berlin's How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning, an original copyright deposit by Irving Berlin. But we also have songs by people that you've never heard of and will never hear of. Apparently, 60% of the songs that were copyrighted during this World War I period were written by women. I say apparently because a lot of the songs were written, and the attribution is 2 initials and a last name. And it was common for women to write 2 initials and a last name so that they wouldn't be discriminated against.
Anonymous, often enough, has been woman. Some treasures are objects without words or names, placed only vaguely in time, their individual history lost. Once upon a time, Native American flutes were used to court a lover, heal the sick, or praise the heavens and earth. Some were simple whistles carved from animal bones. Others were elaborate and painted.
Some of our really authentic treasures from even the traditional point of view are our recordings of people who aren't famous, our field recordings of American Indians, of their chants from 1913 are now recorded, and one can go back to those firsthand.
The Winter Count depicts the history of the Brule Indians of South Dakota and Nebraska in panels over 5 feet high. Its creator, Batiste Good, inherited the history. The story had been passed on from generation to generation for almost 700 years. It begins around 1200 AD. The Winter Count tells of success and failure, the bounty of the season, the deaths of leaders, powerful storms and droughts, terrible epidemics and wars. Every winter, the tribe would count to see who was left. Survival, perhaps, is the better part of history. The Civil War was a titanic struggle between governments, but it was, like all wars, fought by individual people.
We have a pocket diary of a soldier, a common soldier. It's not a treasure in and of itself. It doesn't impart extraordinary new information.
I played cards all of the forenoon, and in the afternoon went to bed, and in the evening went to a dance and had a game.
And one diary is not much different from another, but taken by scores and hundreds, there are very significant insight into the daily experience of soldiers in the course of the civil conflict.
Powder horns, like this one from the French and Indian War, were indispensable companions to foot soldiers. They were often elaborately carved. A chronicle of time and place in pictures like the Winter Count. They tell the story not of a tribe, but the memories of one man. Autobiography in Scrimshaw. Published in 1760, this autobiography was one of the earliest authored by an African American. A narrative of uncommon sufferings and surprising deliverance of Britton Hammond, a Negro man, servant to General Winslow of Marshfield. Britton Hammond was a slave.
The historical record of America is not just one of triumph, but also of transgression. One of the great strengths of the library's collections is its documentation of civil rights, for example, which has many happy stories to tell, but of course many unhappy ones.
It isn't just a collection of the things about which we are rightfully proud. It's about life and failure and flaws and shadows and darkness and tragedy and all of the failings that we human beings are subject to.
I was surprised at how many of the narratives the Africans and African Americans say, we were treated like cattle. We were auctioned like animals. The feeling of degradation, to be auctioned on the auction block, to have mothers sold apart from their children and wives from husbands. The feeling of it, the passion of it. On the other hand, we have the accounts of slave traders, slave dealers, insurance agents who insured cargoes of slaves. Slavery was big business. Very, very big business, and those involved made lots of money.
A small group of Africans, men and children, were captured on the west coast of Africa in 1839, brought to the Caribbean, and sold to some Spaniards.
And while they were being transported in the Caribbean, the Africans on board mutinied. They killed the captain and the cook, but called upon two of the other white crewmen to steer them back to Africa.
But the slaver was captured, and an artist's sketch of Joseph Cinque, the wild man charged with murder and mutiny, appeared in the New York papers.
It's part of the education of Americans to see that he's not the wild-eyed fanatic.
Former President John Quincy Adams defended Cinque before the U.S. Supreme Court.
He was 73. He said, my teeth are falling from my head, but I will go forth and I will do what I can to defend these Africans. And in the brief, he said, everybody has been very concerned about the rights of Spain, the rights of Spanish citizens. He said, but what about the rights of these Africans? Don't they have rights too? They were free people in their own continent, minding their own business. They have been kidnapped, brought across the Atlantic Ocean, and enslaved. Shouldn't they too be freed? If these Africans could simply be taken and enslaved, then couldn't everybody in America? When would it stop? And his argument prevailed. The Africans were freed. He worked with a group of people who helped to send the Africans back to Africa.
But this was an isolated instance. Slavery, in fact, prevailed, even continuing long after its legal abolition. The American Treasures exhibition displays two versions of the slavery code of the District of Columbia.
In America, every slave state had laws regulating slavery. Legally, slaves were treated much like real estate. The city of Georgetown had a law forbidding slaves to fly kites. Why, Lord knows. Slaves or free blacks would be forbidden to congregate in groups of more than 2 or 3. If you read it now, one's impression is, my God, this is horrible. But for the time and place, the district was relatively liberal as far as slavery went. You could borrow money on the security of slaves, and we'd have a contract for that. If I don't pay you back, you get my slave. Slaves were wagered in gambling. You lose at poker, well, your slave has a new master.
I know when I was growing up, I learned that slaves just sang and danced and were passive. I needed to know that black people always wanted to be free, that Africans wanted to be free. And I think all Americans need to know that that's a very important phenomenon, that freedom wasn't just dished out by Abraham Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation to people who didn't care, that we as black people have fought in every war, from the French and Indian War. We've shed our blood and we've died in every war. It is as much our country as anybody else's, so that we're not asking favors from anybody, that we've helped build this nation.
A Georgia slave named Houston Cartier Holloway recalls the moment of freedom phonetically written in his narrative.
In 1865, the master called about 20 of the slaves up to the house and told them that they had been freed. And he said, amen, amen, amen. He said the master said he felt free too, like a bird out of a cage. Amen, amen, amen. Then he goes on to say that it was difficult for blacks to be free because they didn't know how to be free. And he says it was difficult for the whites to have free black people around them because many of them had not experienced, at least not free blacks in great numbers. So you get a first-person account. What is happening? What's happening in the lives of the slaves, happening in the lives of the masters. You learn all sorts of things. The people then were like people now. Some of the masters were very kind, and the slaves stayed on with them as employees. Others, the slaves got away as far and as fast as they could.
In the 1930s, photographer Dorothea Lange traveled around California and captured a kind of economic slavery, the lives of migrant farm workers during the Depression. Lange selected, cropped, printed, mounted, and wrote captions for the pictures herself. The result is a series of notebooks that document a forgotten people. A few years later, Ansel Adams took pictures of a people that America was trying hard to forget, Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II.
There he documented in about 200 photographs the life that these American citizens had recreated for themselves under such harsh conditions.
You see the camp, and in the background, you see the massive Sierra Range as kind of a backdrop. And if you know Ansel Adams' work, massive ranges of mountains played an important role. These people would have to go over those mountains to get out.
We act as the custodians of the total collective memory of this country, and not just a selective memory. We don't try to rewrite the past. It's all there. We're not proud that people have been oppressed, but this does represent an aspect of America.
We have to know who we are and how we got to where we are and at what cost and what mistakes we made. And let's, for heaven's sakes, not make them again. We have to understand that this system isn't just a birthright that will work of itself without our participating in it. We have to have an educated, voting population. We are a government of the people, and if the people are ignorant, it will become an ignorant government.
And that's what I think the Library of Congress is all about in this great storehouse of information. It's not just about idealizing America. It's about what are the flaws, where have we gone wrong, so you can learn from that.
You may walk in here without any credential other than some kind of identification card. We are, if you wish, the ultimate democratic process.
No questions are asked about who are you, why do you want to use this library? As long as you look like you're older than high school age, you are served.
We don't censor anything. We believe in keeping the entire record here. That you may like some of the things that we Americans have done, and you may dislike some of the things that we've done. And you can think anything you want. And you can come to any conclusion you want. There's no one checking you to find out what you're saying.
It's the library version of a very basic American principle: free speech.
Dear sir, I do not salute the flag because I have promised to do the will of God. That means I must not.
Here at the library, we have the letter which was sent by a young man, Billy Gobitis, age 10, to his school board in Pennsylvania, telling them that he couldn't salute the flag because this was a violation of the way he read the Bible. This case went up to the Supreme Court, and in 1940, the court ruled that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania could insist that its students salute the flag. 3 years later, they reversed their stand because obviously they had violated this pupil's First Amendment rights.
Your pupil, Billy Gobitis.
It's important to see that our actions and opinions as individuals have an effect on other individuals, and that they have an effect on a group, on a nation.
This note was a promise that all men yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit.
Martin Luther King speaks very bluntly about what has been denied black Americans and other Americans. But he also says that his sense of injustice is based on the promises that were made to him by the founding documents, that is the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. These are the documents that we have on display, the documents that made promises, asserted something about human nature, told people what they could achieve, which is almost infinite. And there's Martin Luther King, who grew up on those promises, saying that he's here to collect on the promissory note.
Give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
Sometimes the promises have begun to be collected, often at terrible cost.
1865, blacks are liberated after the Civil War, so that we are only 132 years removed from slavery. That's all that we as blacks have been free in this country, 2 65-year-old people back to back. What a difference it makes in understanding the kind of phenomenal accomplishments of African Americans. When we were freed, a very small percentage of us were literate. By the turn of the 20th century, about 65% of all black people were literate. And that happened within a 35-year period is also phenomenal. That blacks, old and young, mothers and daughters and grandmothers, everybody coming together, whites and blacks coming from the north, all over the place, to begin to teach these slaves how to be a part of the American political process.
People, from school children to great leaders, have changed us. Freedom is perhaps our greatest treasure. Today, the world's largest library still mirrors the democratic principles of the nation's founders. The Library of Congress and the way it works is itself a national treasure, the crown jewels of a democracy.
The idea that we record information about ourselves, that we keep the bad and the good, that we make it accessible to people, all of it is an embodiment of the Founding Fathers' understanding that a democracy is in fact based on information. Everybody has a role to play in creating their government and creating it every single generation.
Why should we be interested in history? What is the importance of history? I learn about myself when I learn history. I'm seeking to find out who I am, John Hebert, Louisiana Cajun, and how I fit into this whole that we call Louisiana, or this whole we call the United States, or eventually the world. And I think history provides us that opportunity to connect individually as a person to a larger place, and therefore we can answer the question, why am I here? What am I doing here?
To me, one of the miracles of our way of life, our society, is our library system. We have free libraries. It's pure democracy. The minute you cross that threshold, everybody has equal access, everybody is treated equally. We still have more libraries in America today than we have McDonald's. There are more children in summer library reading programs than play in the Little League. And our greatest library is our National Library, our Library of Congress. That is the ultimate library. It's the greatest library in the world.
The treasures are there, objects and words from thousands of lives. A treasure, in the end, is in the heart and mind of the beholder. Every treasure is different, as different from each other as people are. But we value that difference. Diversity. The diversity of the American spirit. And of the people who inhabit this earth.
Funding for this program has been made possible through a generous donation from Xerox Corporation, whose innovative document solutions, products, services, and support are designed to enhance business productivity. To order a videocassette of American Treasures of the Library of Congress, please call 1-800-274-1307 or write to WQED Video, 4802 Fifth Avenue, Pittsburgh, PA 15213.
This is PBS.